Hey there, I'm FriendlyCosmonaut, and we are going to be making Breakthrough. And we'll be doing this over a two-part series. Now, this tutorial is aimed at beginners, so if you're new to programming or GameMaker, then you should be totally fine. Now, obviously this tutorial is going to teach you to make a game, but more than that, I want this to be an example of how to approach making a game from scratch. So what your workflow might actually look like and how you might solve problems as they arise. So, first things first, let's load up GameMaker. You might already be familiar with this start page, but this is just where we can go to launch our projects and also explore some resources, such as the marketplace, tutorials, and demos. So we're going to go ahead and make a new project. And now we have two options. So we can make the game in drag and drop or GameMaker Language. And this will just change how we go about programming our game. So if we use GameMaker Language or GML, then we're going to be using actual code to make our games. If we use drag and drop, then we'll be using a visual scripting language and constructing our programming logic out of action blocks. If you're watching this video, then you've probably already decided to go with GML, but if you find it difficult or you think you might prefer a more visual approach to scripting, then feel free to check out the drag and drop video. So we're going to go ahead and hit GameMaker Language, and I'm going to save this as Breakthrough Tutorial. And we'll hit enter and load the project up. So here we are in a fresh new project, and I'm just going to spend a couple minutes taking you through the interface if you're not familiar with it. So right here in the center is our workspace. So this is where we're going to be doing all of our work. All of our editors are going to be popping up here, and we can actually add more workspaces by clicking this little plus up here. And this can be handy, for example, if you're working with two monitors and you want to drag this one over to the other monitor, or if you want to just have kind of two different tabs open on your project. So we can dock it back here and quit it. We can also mess around with this layout a little bit. So for example, down here are some docked panels, and we can grab any of these and move them around the project. And at any point, if you've messed around with this a little bit too much and you want to restore back to the default, then we can come over to layouts and just reset the layout. Now, most of these tabs down here, we're probably not going to be looking at just as we're starting out, probably with the exception of the output panel, because we'll see this popping up when we run our game for testing. And this is just where we can see the game compiling, and if there's any compiling errors, they'll pop up here. But that's fine for now, we can close this. Or you can hit F12 to dock all of the panels. Now up here, I do just want to point a couple things out. So in the file menu, we can actually open up a whole new IDE. So if you want to have two entirely different GameMaker projects up, you can hit that. And in the preferences, there's a lot of things here that you can tweak, from the actual appearance of the IDE to some important settings. So for example, we can change the language and the skin here. We can change the colors of the resources tree and the fonts. And of course, if we want to restore to default, we can just click this right here. All right. Now there's a few buttons up here that are kind of quick buttons to perform some tasks or get to some particular menus a little bit quicker. So we can go back to the start page here, open new projects and save them. We can also create an executable, which is what you'll be doing once you've created your game. Next, we have a few very important buttons. So this one right here, the little triangle, is the play button, and this will run your game. So if we run it right now, we're going to get an empty window because we haven't actually done anything. If we hit this square button right here, it's going to stop the game. It's going to stop it running. This debug will also run the game, but it's going to run it in debug mode. And the debugger is kind of a tool that we can use to profile our game, to check on performance, to check for bugs. And again, it's probably not something we're going to be doing right now, but it is something you might want to look into later. Now, finally, over here, we have our resources, and I'm just going to slide this up to be a little bit larger. And this is the heart of our project. So anything we use or make is going to be stored here in the different sections. So the main ones that we're going to be using are the sprites, objects, rooms, and also sounds and fonts. So let's start with sprites. So you can think of sprites as the containers for any image that we're going to be using in the game. So all of our objects, like the bat, the ball, all of the backgrounds, they're going to be represented as a sprite in our project. So you can import sprites, or you can actually use the inbuilt sprite editor to create the sprites yourself. So let's make our first sprite. Let's make the brick. So I'm going to right click and create the sprite. And now it's going to tell us to name it. So I'm just going to call it brick for now. So I'm going to just open this a little bit and hit F12 to dock those tabs. And right here you can see the image as well as a few options over here. So one of the most important ones to choose first is this one right here. So this will actually resize the sprite. And for the brick, I want it to be kind of rectangular shaped. So I'm just going to change this from 32 height down to 16. Right, so now it's resized. And by the way, you can middle click and move the mouse around to kind of place the image in this section, just as you can move around the interface by middle clicking. And we can control and zoom in to zoom in. All right, so to actually bring up the sprite editor, we can double click on this right here or hit edit image. All right, so now we have the image editor and we can move around this in the same way as we did before by middle clicking and dragging and control and zooming in and out. So I'm going to draw a very basic brick right here. I'm going to use the rectangle tool and I'm going to use the black color to do an outline of the brick. And then I'm just going to color it in white. And we're going to actually use code to color this in later, but for now it's just a white brick. All right, so we can exit out of this. And there we go, there's our brick. We're going to just leave everything else at default. So now I am going to create the object for this sprite, because at the moment a sprite is just an image. It can't actually do anything on its own. But we can attach it to an object to get it to appear in the game. So objects are where we put all of the game logic. So they will be in charge of doing absolutely everything to make the game work. And they're going to do this by performing the instructions that we tell them with our code, right? So every single thing in the game is going to happen because of something that we put in an object. And essentially all of the programming logic that we're going to use is going to boil down to telling the objects, if this, then that. So if a certain event happens, do a certain action. And of course we can create layers and layers of this to create complex behavior. So let's just go ahead and create an object. And let's call this brick again. But you'll see that if we attempt to do this, it's going to tell us that this is an invalid name because we've already used the word brick. And names must be unique. And this is a really important point. We can't actually call two different assets the same thing. And this is why we are actually going to use a prefix for our different resources. So instead of just brick for the sprite, I'm going to put SPR underscore brick. So we can do this by just hitting F2 and renaming it, or we can right click and hit rename. And we can do the same for the object now. So not only does this allow us to call it both of these brick, but now we know what the resource actually is by its prefix. So this is a sprite and this is an object. Let's move on to rooms now. So by default, GameMaker has already made a room, so room 0. And we'll just use this for now, but I might just rename this to continue with our naming convention, and I'll call it RM Game. So now let's double click on this to bring up the room editor. So a room is kind of like our game world, or more specifically a game level, because you can actually have multiple rooms in our game and then switch between them. So only one room will be running at a time, and if an object, even though they're in the resources panel, if they're not in the room that's running, then they don't exist functionally in the game. So think of objects in programming just like how they exist in your mind. So just like the idea that you have of a dog. So you know that the object dog has certain properties. It has fur, a tail, 4 legs, and so on. You know it performs certain behaviors too. It wags its tail and it fetches balls. But that doesn't mean a dog object has to exist in the world just because it's in your head. So for example, you probably also have an idea of what a unicorn is, its properties and behaviors, but we know that unicorns don't exist because there aren't any instances of them in our world. So in the same way, to make an object exist in the game world, we have to create an instance of it. And that's what dragging an object into the room does. And we can even drag multiple instances of this brick into the room. And we can even give these different bricks different properties, just like how different instances of dogs can have different properties. So they can be different colors, sizes, and breeds. And we can do this right here by tweaking their variables and even their code. Now, before I explain anything else about the room, let's just run it. So remember, we can hit F5 or come up and hit this play button. And as you can see here, we just get a black window just as before. So we did create our objects. They are actually there in the room just as we placed them, but we can't actually see anything. We can't see that sprite that we were drawing. And that's because we didn't actually tell them to draw anything. So let's do that. Let's come back to the workspace and back to this object. And what we're going to do is assign that sprite to this object. So where it says no sprite, we're going to click this and use SPR brick. So now if we come back to the room, there are our bricks. But as you can see, they're actually quite small in the room. So what I'm going to do is change the dimensions of this room. So over here on this side, up the top here are the different layers in our room. So at the moment we have an instances layer and we have a background layer. So you can see I can even toggle their visibility right here. The instances are where we place all of our instances, and you'll notice, for example, we can't drag an instance into the background layer. We have to drag it into an instances layer. And there are a few other different types of layers in here too, so we can create more background and instances layers. We can have tile layers, paths, assets, and we can even create folders that we can use to organize the different layers. And you can do different things in different layers. So in the instances layer, we can see right here in the layer properties, all of the different instances that are in this layer. And for the background, we can actually change what the background is showing. So we can assign a sprite to the background. So for example, we can assign this brick sprite. We can tile that image horizontally and vertically to make it take up the entire thing. And we can even stretch it. You can also actually animate it or have it move across the screen as the game is playing, and we can come up to here and press play to see that animation. I'm going to actually keep everything just as default for now, so I'm going to keep everything black, but you can have a play with that if you want. Now down the very bottom is where we can change the dimensions of the room. So down here in width and height, let's change this to be 640 by 480. That seems like a pretty good size for our game. And I might just move these bricks. I'm going to hold Control so I can select all of them and move them up to the center a little bit more. Alright, so that looks a bit better. So now when we run our game, we should see the window should have changed size and we can see our bricks now. Excellent. Alright, now we should move on to actually making the game. So where should we start? A lot of the time, developing a game is all about breaking down big tasks into incremental small ones. So let's practice how we're going to approach this. We know our game is going to be about using a bat to hit a ball into these bricks. And if we miss the ball and it hits the bottom edge, we lose. If we get rid of all the bricks, we win. So those are the main mechanics and objects that we need in our game. So to start off with, let's just get them actually showing up here in the room. So let's make a few more sprites and objects. So we can make the ball. And I want this to be a little bit smaller than the brick, so I'm going to make this 16 by 16. And we'll hit apply. I'm going to double click on this. And I'm going to use the circle tool to draw the ball. And this time I'm just going to make it yellow. Alright. And now I'm going to make the bat. So this is going to be what the player is controlling to hit the ball with. And I'm going to make this a little bit bigger than a brick. So instead of 32 width, I'm going to have 64. But I'll change the height to 16. Alright, so let's come into it. Just going to dock those panels. And again, I'm going to use this rectangle tool. And let's color it a nice green. Alright. So those are the sprites for all the main objects that we need. Let's go ahead and create the objects for them. So the ball, obj ball, and we'll assign the sprite and the bat. And let's come back to our room and let's actually place some of these objects. So since a lot of our bricks are 32 by 16, I'm going to actually change this grid to represent that. So I'm going to come up to here, to this little drop down, and I'm going to go to the grid and hit 16. So you can see now if we are dragging a brick around, it should snap to this grid. So now I'm going to bring the bat into the room and the ball. And one other thing that I just want to point out is you'll notice as you're dragging this around, the anchor for the objects are at the top left. So for example, if I drag this all the way up to here, double click on it, we can see that its position is 0, 0 because the top left corner of this object, which is its anchor, is positioned at 0, 0. And if we move it around the room, you can see its position is changing. So for example, if we wanted it to actually be anchored in the center, then we can come back to this and change where the origin of the sprite is, so its anchor point. We can drag that and place that ourselves, or we can use a preset here. So for example, the middle center. And I'm going to do that for all of my objects. So now if we come back to the room editor, you'll see everything is kind of shifted over because its origin point has changed. All right, so I'm just going to place the ball right on top of the bat. And now let's actually make up a little level. So instead of just dragging in all of the bricks one by one to make a more complicated shape for our player to destroy, what we can also do is kind of paint the bricks on. So if I highlight the brick and then press Alt, then we can use that to paint bricks into the level. So you can make whatever shape you want and have a little bit of fun painting the level. All right, and if we run the game, we should see everything coming up nicely. And at this point, we remember that our bricks are all white, but we actually want different colored bricks to be appearing. So how about we get that working? And like I said, we're going to actually do this in code. So I'm going to quit this room editor and I'm going to come over to the brick object and we're going to use our first bit of code. So what we're going to do is actually tint this sprite to be any number of a few random colors. So we might tint it pink or green or orange or whatever. And I want to do this as soon as the object is created in the room. So remember what I said, that all of our programming logic comes down to basically saying if this, then that. So what we want to basically say is if the object is created or when it's created, then change its color. So we can do that by adding an event, and you can see all of the different events down here. So for example, when it gets destroyed, when it's created, when we press a button, when a frame gets run or a step is run. But the one we want is create. So when it's created, we want to do an action. And I'm just going to zoom in here. So if you want to make your font bigger, you can actually hit F8 a few times to make that font a little bit larger. Okay. And now in here, I'm going to change what's called an instance variable for this brick. So all instances have a bunch of important values. So for example, everything has an X and Y position that we can change in code. And you can see they're coming up as green because they are instance variables. So all the instance variables will come up as green. And what we can actually do is if you middle click on this, it's going to bring up the documentation page for it. And you can actually read about it. So this is the documentation, and over on the left we can see, right here, instance variables. So the X is just one of many instance variables. So what I want to change is one of the sprite properties, so the color of it. And that is called the image blend. And as you can see, we can use the image blend to kind of tint the sprite. So this is what we're going to do. So we're going to go image blend, and we're going to make it equal a certain color. And there are a few variables that are called constants that are already built into GameMaker that represent certain colors. But you can also use, for example, the HSV values. But I'm just going to use these constants because they're easy. So if we go C underscore, then you can see all of the colors that are built into GameMaker. So for example, I could just go C red, and this is going to set the image blend for every single one of those bricks in our room to be red. But that's not what we want. We actually want a randomization of the bricks. So some of them will be red, some of them will be yellow. We want it to be random. So what I'm going to do is actually not just set it to red, but I'm going to get it to choose. So I'm going to write choose. And now I can get it to actually choose between a number of different colors. So C red, C blue, C yellow, C green, fuchsia, and orange. And you can add more colors if you like. And we can also actually put this over multiple lines just to make it a bit more readable. Just like that. And this is called a function. You can see it coming up in orange here. And this means that basically whatever we put between these brackets, the function is going to perform some kind of operation on it. So it's going to take in certain values and then it's going to spit out something new, right? That's kind of what a function does. But basically, as it intuitively supposes, it will choose any one of these. So now we can get the image blend, tinting those bricks to be different colors. So that's actually all we need. So if we run the game, we can actually see what effect that has on the bricks. So there you go. Every single instance of our brick, because remember, they're all unique instances, have performed this bit of code when they were created. And they've tinted themselves different colors. All right, perfect. And now the next thing we have to do is obviously we still can't actually move the player or the ball. So as I said, a lot of the time when I'm building my game, I kind of just keep adding small things to it, running the game, and then seeing what I have to do next. So let's actually get this object moving. Okay, so if we come over to our objects again and double click on bat, and I'm going to dock those windows again. Now I want to get it to move in response to our input. So remember, the bat can move to the left and to the right, and I'm going to get it to do that when we press the arrow keys. So we can just add an event, and we can go to a key down event, right? So take note of the different names for this. So we have key down, pressed, and key up, and these are different events. So the key press event is only going to happen on the one frame that we actually press the key. And that's not how we want to move. We just want to move if we know that the key is down. So we're going to have key down, and let's just go left for now. So in the event that we have pressed the left key down, then we want to change the X position of the bat. So we want to move it to the left. And of course, the X origin, so the 0 for an X, it starts over on the very left of the screen. So if we're in the center of the room at something like 200, and we want to move it towards 0, then we're going to be decreasing X. But we can't just set X equal to a certain number, right? Because that's just going to make it snap to a certain point. So what we actually want it to do is equal what it currently is minus 7, let's just say. And another way we can write this is X minus equals 7. So that's just kind of a quicker way of writing that in code. It means exactly the same thing. So now we can do the exact same thing in key down, right? So we'll make X equal X plus 7, right? Because we're moving to the right side. So let's test the game. And if you move the left and right keys, you can see that we're moving just as expected. But if that is too fast for you, and let's say that you want to change that value from 7 down to 5 or something, or maybe you even want it faster, then we're going to have to go into both of these and change this number. And instead of doing that, what we can actually do is set a variable instead. So let's add another event called create, and I'm going to make up a variable called SPD. So this is going to represent the speed of the bat. And I can't just use the variable speed because that is actually a built-in variable, and we're not going to be using that. We're going to make up our own one. So let's set that to 7. And now, when this bat gets created, it's going to create a new variable, and now, as long as this object exists in the game, our program is kind of going to remember that whenever we write speed, we actually mean 7. So now I can replace this with speed, and it's going to work in the exact same way, except now I only have one place that I have to change it. So now if we run it, as you can see, it works the exact same, and you can just tweak that variable from here if you want. Now, what you might notice is if we go outside the bounds of the room, the bat is still allowed to move, and you might want to prevent the bat from doing that. So we want to kind of say, if the bat has gone outside of the room, then actually don't let it move. Don't do this action right here. And instead, make sure that the bat is actually level with the room. So we're going to do a check here, right? So we're going to check a condition, kind of like our own little event inside here. So we want to check if X is greater than 0, right? So if it's on that side of the room, if it's not at the edge, then we will let it move, right? So with an if statement, we put the condition in here, and then if this is true, it's going to run whatever we put here in the curly brackets. But if this is false, then anything in the curly brackets is not going to be run. So let's give that a go and see if it worked. So let's move the bat over, but you can see the bat is sort of half going outside of the room. And remember, that's actually because of where we set the origin for the bat. So its X position is actually in the center. So if you move it over all the way, this code is only kicking in when the center of the bat is here. So what we might want to do is also add the width of the bat to this calculation. So let's go if X is greater than 0 plus, and what we're going to do is sprite X offset. And what this variable is how far over from the 0, 0 position up here is the origin. And for us, that's going to be half of the sprite width, so that's perfect. So now if we run it, we can see that it is wrapping a lot better. But it's not quite right. A little bit of the sprite is actually still over the edge. And the reason for this might become obvious if we go through the logic. So we have to think about the case where it's right at the edge of the screen. why is it still being allowed to move over one? So let's think about it. So if the X value is right at the edge plus the X offset, then it is actually still going to be fulfilling this condition. And then it's going to move over one more time. And then the next time it tries to move, it's not going to be able to. But it is still being able to move if it's right on the edge. So what we need to do, so we just need to add speed right here. Because then we're kind of checking the position that we're going to be at. So finally, this should work. There we go. So we're right snugly at the edge. So this is actually exactly how a lot of game development is going to go. You're going to start off coding something and then you're going to realize it's not quite right, and then you're going to go through the logic of the code, find out why that is, fix it, test it again, and there might even be another thing that you need to fix. And that's just kind of how it's going to go. So you always start off small and just get the main thing working, and then you kind of refine it as you go. So now that that's working for the left direction, let's copy this line and put it in the right as well. So I'm going to paste that in. I'm going to tab this over, close our curly bracket. And now instead of checking if we're actually on that left boundary, we're going to be checking the right boundary. So we don't want 0, but we want the room width. And now again, we could just put that hard value that we put in the settings of the game. But what we can also do is get the room width via code. So literally there is a variable called room_width. And now we're checking not plus the X offset, but minus it. And over here, minus the speed. And we don't want this to be a greater than, we want it to be less than. So if X is less than the room width minus the X offset minus the speed, then we will let it move over. So let's give that a test. Move to the right side, and it is working just the same way. All right, perfect. So we have the bat moving how we want. Now we want to be moving the ball. So there are a few things to consider about the ball's movement. At the very start, we kind of want it to sit on the player's bat until the player is ready and we hit a button and it's going to fly off in a random direction. And then from then on, we have to set up the collisions with the bricks, the boundaries, and also the player. So there's quite a few things to get done. So again, we're just going to break this down and start small. So the very first thing we want to do is to get the ball moving from where it currently is, to kind of fly off in a random direction. So let's start with that. So let's come over to the ball, and kind of like what we were doing with the bricks, we're going to get it to pick a random direction in its create event, so as soon as it gets created, and we'll just make it fly off. So to pick that random direction, well, I say random, but I do want it to be within a kind of range. And a very important point is in GameMaker what exactly direction is. So 0 degrees on a circle in GameMaker is actually pointing to the right, and up is 90 degrees. So I kind of want it between 0 and 180 because I want it to go up, and probably not at those extreme ends of very close to 0 or 180. So we're probably going to have a range of, say, let's go 45 to 135. So we want it between this range, and like before, we're going to use one of those random functions. So instead of just choose either of those numbers, we'll choose randomly from a range of numbers between those two. So random range. And now this function is going to return a number between that range. So we want to save that number in a variable. And we're going to use another built-in variable here. So direction. Right, so this is the direction that the ball is going to move in. But this isn't enough to get it actually moving. For that, we're going to have to set the ball's speed. So let's just set its speed to something like 3 for now. And this is all we need to get it to move. So this is another way to control objects' movement by using the built-in variables direction and speed. So unlike the player object, when we were coding its movement kind of manually by changing the X coordinate, this will kind of ensure that the ball is always moving until we set it back to 0. So if we run it, let's have a look. It should immediately fly off in a random direction. All right. But remember how I said I wanted the ball to kind of sit on the player until we hit space? So we actually want to delay setting these variables until the player hits the spacebar. So what we could do is actually move all of this to the spacebar event. So we can go key pressed, and we're not going to do key down this time. We're going to do key pressed because we only want it to go off the one time we hit the spacebar. And we can put all of that in here. But if we run that and hit space twice, you'll see that this event is going to run whenever we hit the spacebar. So we don't want that. We only want the player to be able to kind of send the ball off one time. So we need to be checking something here to see if we have already done this. And I'm just going to call this go. So I'm going to say go equals false to begin with at the very start, and we'll only allow this to run if go is still false. So we can check if go is equal to false, then we will perform this. And we'll also set go equal to true, right? And note that I have put a double equals for this because this is a comparison, whereas this is setting the variable, right? So we're asking right here, is go equal to false? If we put this, we would be setting it equal to false. And funnily enough, in GameMaker, this will actually still run. But in other languages, you will have to specify the double equal. So it's good practice to write this and a good idea to get into good programming habits. So make sure you put double equals for comparisons and one equals when you're setting. All right, so this way we can only do this once. So let's test that one more time. And you can see if we press space multiple times, it's not going to work. All right, perfect. Now, one more thing that we want is right at the starting point, if we move the bat, we want this ball to move with us. So one more thing that we want to do is check if go is equal to false, then we want to move this ball onto the player. And we're going to do that in a new event because none of these really fit that criteria. We kind of want to do it every single frame of the game. So that's why we're going to use a step event. This event kind of represents a frame of the game. So this event is called to run every step or every frame of the game. So it's going to be running 60 times per second. And you can change that in your game options, but it should be 60 by default. And this event is kind of where you do the majority of your complicated if checks. And you can also do movement in here. You can check for keyboard presses within the step event itself. So in here, we're going to check if go is equal to false. And by the way, another way to write this is actually if not go, right? So that means not. So it's the same thing as writing this, if go is equal to false. So if not go, then we want to move our ball, so its X position, to be equal to the bat. But how do we get the bat's X position? So this is referring to our variable, right? Well, to get access to a different object's variables, we can use an accessor. So we can go obj bat.x. So now that is the bat's X position, not our one. So we are now setting our X position to be the same as the player. Let's give that a go. There we go. And when we press space, it's going to go off. All right, as you can see, it doesn't actually hit the bricks when we go off. So that's the next thing that we want to do. So we want the ball to do something when it collides with the bricks. And we could actually put this in the step event. There is functions for checking for collisions, but there's also a built-in collision event that we can use. And as for whether you should use one or the other, it just depends on how you want to organize the project. Sometimes it's nice to be able to see everything in the step event, for example, so you can see all the logic of your object, but sometimes it's nice to have these little sections. So we'll just use this one. So now, when it collides with the brick, what behavior are we expecting? We want the ball to kind of bounce off the brick. And now we could calculate this ourselves, but there is actually a handy function for the kind of bounce movement that we are after. So it's called move, bounce, all. And I'll just bring up the documentation for this. So this will kind of calculate the bounce for us and start the ball moving in the different direction. And we just want to set this to true. Basically, to, in this instance where we are colliding with the brick, calculate the bounce and set the ball on its way. Right? And we're going to do that every time we collide. All right. Now we also want it to bounce off the bat. But we don't just want the brick to turn around. We want the new direction of the ball to kind of depend on where it hits our bat. So if it hits it right on this side, we want the ball to fly off away like that. And if it hits it right in the middle, we want it to bounce straight up. So a little bit different to how it interacts with the brick. So let's add a new event. Collision with the bat. And now we want its new direction to be equal to, and now we're going to take advantage of our sprite's origin point. So remember how we centered our origins in the center? This is actually going to be really important because now we can draw a line between the bat's X and Y position and the ball's X and Y position, and we can send it off in that direction. And we can do that using point direction. So this function, as you can see down here, it takes in 4 arguments. Or if we bring up the documentation, you can see right here, it wants the X and Y component of this, and then the x and y component of the second one. So we want the bat's x and y first. And just like here, we could use obj_bat.x and y, but we can also use a keyword that's only really available to us in this collision event called other. So we can use other.x because other is referring to the other object in this collision. So not the ball, the other object, so the bat. And I might just do this over multiple lines. So other.x, other.y, and then we want our x and our y. Just like that. All right, so let's give that a run. There we go. And there is our next problem. We want the ball to be bouncing off the walls of the room as well. So we're going to want another event. So add event, and this is going to be in other. So we want intersect boundary. So if the ball is intersecting with the boundary of the room. Now this event is going to run if we hit any of the boundaries, but we want it to be doing different things depending on what boundaries that it hits. For now, we'll start off with the left and the right boundaries because in those cases, we just want it to kind of bounce backwards. So we can check if, and now I'm going to use a couple other built-in variables. So there is one called bboxLeft, and this is the collision box of the object, or the bounding box. So this means that we don't just have to check its x position, which remember, that's right in the middle of the ball, but we can say if the left side of the box, if that is over the intersection, because that's what should be happening if we've intersected with the left boundary. So if bboxLeft is less than 0, then we know we're on the left boundary. In that case, what we want to do is flip the direction of the ball. And another thing that we can actually do right here is instead of changing that direction variable, we can change the speed. So there's something called horizontal speed. And this is kind of the horizontal component of the speed. And what we can do is just flip whatever it is. So we can make it equal itself times -1. So that should just flip whatever it is. And actually, we want it to do that same thing if we hit the right side of the room. So we can say or, right? So this means if this is true or whatever this is true. So we can say if bbox right is greater than the room width, then we also want the h speed to flip. So let's check that. There we go, so it's bouncing back. And now for the top one, we can check if bboxTop is less than, and now the top of the room is actually the 0 origin for y. So y actually starts at the top for GameMaker, not the bottom. So we want to check if the bounding box for this ball is less than 0. So if that's true, then let's make vspeed exactly like here, except actually let's do the other way of writing it. So we can actually do times equals. So that means equals itself times whatever you put here, so -1. So let's give that a go. There we go, so it bounces off the top. All right. Now, if it hits the bottom, right, so if bbox bottom is greater than the room height, then that means it has gone past the bat. And in that case, we want to take away one of the player's lives. We haven't set up the lives yet, but that's what we would want to put here. Just for now, I'm going to put a comment, so with a double slash, and just say subtract a life. So this is how you can kind of write words in your code without it having to actually run, because if I just wrote this like that, this would cause an error, right? So I'm just going to put that in as a comment. So now that we've set up the kind of core mechanics of the game, the movement and collisions, this might be a good place to leave it. In part 2, we'll come back and set up the lives and score and finish the rest of our game. So I'll see you in the next video.